Hi, it's Father Peter Anthony here from St Benet's in Kentish Town. I was thinking you might find it useful to have a few brief book reviews of texts I've been reading whilst we've all been in lockdown and locked inside, to give you some pointers for your own reading at this time. And I want to recommend to you a slightly controversial but very intriguing author called Michel Houellebecq. He's a French writer, and his latest book is called Serotonin. And it's just come out to great applause. Who is he? Well, he's certainly a very controversial figure. He only writes novels which are full of catastrophe, sex, violence, relationship breakdown, depression. They are really quite extraordinary roller coaster rides, but they are very, very good indeed. He is a bit of an enfant terrible, and his stock in trade is essentially shock, but through that shock and the satire and the irony that come with it, he's a really intriguing figure that I think prompts us to reflect exceptionally perspicaciously on the culture and society in which we live. So what is the story of this book? Well, there's basically a slightly clapped out person called Florent who's having a midlife crisis. He's been put on these wonderful antidepressants called Captorix, which basically allows him to cope with life, but it has the side effect of removing from him the capacity to get an erection. So his sex life completely disappears. And the book is a sort of canter through his life and his former relationships as he looks back on this kind of the wreckage of his life, and really yearns. I think the basic book is about the yearning for human love and where on earth that's to be found, the glimmers and moments in his life where he thinks he's come close to it, and then we're sort of sucked down into a kind of terrible denouement at the end where everything goes wrong, as they always does in these books. So what's going on in it? Well, he basically, the protagonist gives up his job, flees Paris. He's been working in the Ministry of Agriculture for years on a good job. He's had a series of 2 or 3 not particularly exciting relationships, all of which have ended in catastrophe. And he leaves his job and flees to Normandy, a place where he has an old friend, and also a place where he remembers once being very happily in love with one of his first girlfriends. And of course what he discovers there is, in actual matter of fact, Normandy isn't this kind of wonderful Elysium where he can go and re-find happiness again, but it's a sort of pretty benighted, terrible place where the economic policies of the European Union and of the French government, in which he's been complicit for 20 years, have just ravaged the place and completely ruined people, and left smallholders completely ruined by the modern market economy. Basically, in most of his novels, there's a strong kind of yearning for yesteryear, and a kind of really visceral critique of modern life in late Western liberal capitalist societies. There's a huge, massive critique of the European Union. Houellebecq is on record as having said that he thought that Brexit was a really great idea. He's exceptionally critical of the European Union, and in this book particularly, you sort of see the kind of at least one particular portrayal of the certain consequences of modern European Union agricultural policy. But there's a sort of yearning for certain cultural certainties of yesteryear, like the collapse of religion is something he's quite interested in. Again, I think officially he describes himself as an atheist, and yet there's this kind of longing for the sort of certain elements of the cultural certainties of a certain period where there was a kind of unifying moral outlook. That's particularly one of the things that's to be seen in this excellent novel, Submission. So he sort of mourns the collapse of traditional religion, but doesn't really got very much to put in its place. That's what he does with a lot of things. He sort of mourns the collapse of something. He mourns the collapse of certain cultural certainties, but he hasn't really got an answer of what should replace it or go in its place. Women's liberation is another thing. His books are full of people who treat and think about women terribly, and his female characters are these sort of one review I was reading said basically they're just sex bots. That there's not much depth to any of the female figures, other than them being reviewed by his protagonists as opportunities for sex, and he definitely sees that cultural shift as having sort of emasculated men and having taken away a whole load of certainties that gave men of a certain age and of a certain class a way of knowing how they fitted into society. He also has an obsession about the railways as well. Yes, the degradation of the SNCF. Of course, I think of the SNCF as an absolute kind of wonderful paradigm of how a railway should be, because I'm comparing it constantly with the dreadful railways we have in Britain. But he's constantly going on about how railways in France weren't what they were, and that kind of stands as a sort of cipher for everything else, doesn't it? He's hugely misanthropic. There isn't a single person in any of these novels that isn't entirely dependent on sex, drugs, alcohol, any of these things to sort of lurch through life. And there's this kind of constant sense that any kind of relationship is just inevitably doomed. But there's a bit in this bit where he goes back in Normandy to find this old friend of his, and he sort of talks about him as being an old undergraduate friend, and then sort of says, we had this wonderful relationship for 2 years when we were students together. That's the only form of real friendship there can possibly ever be, because it lasts for a short time and then it sort of evaporates and it's gone. And you think, get a grip. It's, life isn't that bad. I would unquestionably say that shock and outrage is one of his most well-known and well-used techniques. This book is if you are a little old lady with a heart condition, please do not read this novel, because it will probably, at least don't do it until the coronavirus thing is over, because hospital beds are very highly sought for at the minute. It's full of extraordinarily shocking scenes of extreme sexual gratuity. He has this sort of it begins with this sort of Japanese girlfriend who's a very odd individual indeed, and he sort of discovers a whole series of infidelities, most of which have been pornographically filmed, and he finds these films on her computer. The scene involving the Japanese girlfriend and the 3 dogs did require me to put the book down for a moment to go make a cup of strong tea to recover. But I think in all that shock and outrage, there's surely a really complex and quite fruitful irony going on here. There's a deep trust, I think, between him and the reader, where he knows the reader can tell. He really trusts the reader, and he really says, you can tell when I'm having you on. You can tell when I'm saying something outrageous to shock you, to prompt you to think, when I'm trying to reach for outrage, almost kind of bypassing liberal critics who have, on a whole number of occasions, described horror and outrage for all his sort of politically incorrect opinions on things. I think there's a deep trust between him and the reader, where he says, I don't give a damn about all that rubbish. I can tell that you can read this and are able to sense the irony and the satire in it. So that's why I think one of the most refreshing things about him, I think. So what's actually good about this book, with all the horrors and the extraordinary kind of comings and goings? I think below all the shock and the hoo-ha and the outrageous events in it, and the misanthropy, I think it's a narrative that it exalts and yearns for authentic human connection and love. Now, he finds it only fleetingly and only momentarily, but nonetheless, I think there is deep down an assumption that it is possible. I think his assertion is authentic human connection and love is a very fleeting thing, but it is nonetheless a possible thing. And even if it isn't experienced very much, or it's not a possible thing, the fact that somehow in us there is this yearning for it is itself the kernel of something that is good. That is good. I think this is an incredibly funny book. I tittered and giggled all the way through it. It's a bit like, we've all got one or two of them, mischievous friends that like to put outrageous things on Facebook to upset all the right thinking people, and they'll put some outrageous comment up, and the bien pensant cognoscenti will get all worked up about it, and you'll see the comments kind of clocking in as people get more and more worked up, and you can just see the sort of enjoyment that your mischievous friend has taken in prompting all this moral outrage. There is some of that going on in this, and it's an incredibly funny book in the way in which it satirises all sorts of very particular ways of thinking, both sort of liberal woke culture and also the kind of blokish culture that the protagonist exemplifies. I think Houellebecq kind of sort of presents these things to us and asks us to make verdicts on them rather than being a censorious narrator. He simply kind of ironically presents things to us, outrageous narratives that we are to make some sense of, rather than kind of peddling moral stories. I think that's the thing's going on. I think Houellebecq is obsessed by the right questions in life as well. You know, how to lead a fulfilling life. Where is the good? What is the point of our existence? Why don't we just give up? He's really obsessed with the right questions, and his characters are desperately seeking for that in their really rich inner worlds. I think this one particularly, the degree to which you're really drawn into the inner world of the protagonist, a place of complete honesty, shocking honesty at some points, of irony and satire. You feel quite at home with him, even though some of the things he's saying are quite outrageous. The inner world of the protagonist is an extraordinary thing, and how honestly he's able to talk about the ways in which his kind of moral outlook and sensibilities has been kind of blunted by the society and culture in which he lives. I think also the thing about the protagonist of this book, Florent, is that he's also somebody who realises completely his complicity in the catastrophe that he sees in front of him. He doesn't kind of get consumed by guilt about it, but he does suddenly, I think there's a kind of gradual realising that he's been entirely complicit in some of these catastrophes that they're seeing emerging in the Normandy countryside and the lives of all these ruined farmers. And so he's not the kind of unreflective robot that I think certain critics have made him out to be. So I think he's very good. Anyway, the ending is really odd, and I don't understand it, or at least it's taken me a long time to get my head around it. The last page is really curious. So Florent basically dies of sadness, or kind of gives up, and kind of everything comes to naught, and he actually sort of dies of sadness. It's an extraordinary assertion. And then this last page, he suddenly starts talking about God. God takes care of us. He thinks of us every minute, and he gives us instructions that are sometimes very precise. Those surges of love that flow into our chests and take our breath away, those illuminations, those ecstasies, inexplicable if we consider our biological nature, our status as simple primates, are extremely clear signs. It's as if he's sort of yearning for the idea of God, could conceive that there is some sort of divine purpose to our life, and that that's revealed to us, but that somehow humanity is incapable of ever making any use of those signs, of reaching out to those moments of ecstasy and beauty and illumination. It's an extraordinary ending, which I still need to do a bit more thinking about. I'm not quite sure what I think and what I make of it. Anyway, if you're stuck inside and you want some interesting books to read, there's this Serotonin, and then there is Houellebecq's earlier book, Submission, which is again a kind of shocker about an Islamic candidate becoming president of France, and again with a kind of middle-aged misanthropic principal character who in the end converts to Islam, but who has also in his life been a researcher of Joris Karl Huysmans, which is someone I've also been interested in the past. Both really good. You may find them terrible, you may be horrendously shocked by them, but I commend them to you as at least refreshing reads, and as something that might prevent you from going completely mad in this time of social isolation and distancing. Anyway, there we are.